Welcome to another Singularities podcast. I'm here with Samuel Barnes. Singularities started out as my attempt to build a space that was more conducive to conversations about religion that were grounded in the personal, grounded in the historical personal narrative of someone's journey with religion. One of the reasons why I thought that was necessary and still think that's necessary is because I do believe our society is going through a type of religious moment, specifically in the West, a certain type of Christian moment. And I think that to make those conversations more robust, more productive, and more enriching for everyone, I just think it requires a different type of format that is not too nested in, let's say, abstract universal thinking that's disconnected from the personal, but that is grounded in the personal and the historical narrative of an individual in terms of how they've come to different religious beliefs. And Samuel Barnes is someone who's been on the channel before. I highly recommend checking out a conversation we had on his book, The Iconoclast, and also Samuel Barnes published in the second Philosophy Portal anthology, Abyssal Arrows. And we also had him on the Abyssal Arrows marathon live stream for a conversation in part about his chapter. So I would recommend checking out his work. There will be links in the description to the Iconoclast. There'll be links in the description to his homepage, as well as a link to the Abyssal Arrows if you want to check out his article in that. So with that being the introduction, Samuel, let's just start by just getting a sense of where you're from, the type of upbringing that you had. Was it religious? Was it secular? And what were some of your original ideas about religion and God in that context?
Yeah. Thanks for this opportunity, Cadell. It's always great. You always put a lot of time and effort into engaging my work more than I think it's worth. But yeah, let's have this conversation. I mean, this is interesting. So I'm a Southern English person, and what I mean by that is that I was born in London in Harrow, but I wasn't there for more than a year. So it says London on my birth certificate, but I'm not really like a Londoner. By virtue of my parents' employment, we were moving around boarding school sorts of environments. Go to place. We lived in Oxford. We lived down on the south coast a little bit, and then in Wiltshire later on. So very like Southern English, which explains my generally vaguely posh accent that you can't place anywhere specific, which is quite funny, I think. So yeah, that was where I was geographically. In terms of the home structure, I would argue, and I'm trying not to break the disrespect your mother and father here, but I think it's fair to say that it was not even secular. And what I mean by that is that it's not like an active atheism. It's just in that I would say, yeah, postmodern sort of sense that it's already gone by that point. By like when I was, around in the very late 90s, early 2000s when I was growing up, like it's already gone by that point. It's already, the weekly pilgrimage has been replaced, not to the local church, but to your chosen supermarket, which for anyone who knows enough about, especially Southern British people, like your choice of supermarket is the most important thing, where you can afford to go, whether you go to Asda or Tesco or Waitrose. To be honest, it's the saddest thing about English people. You can probably find out the most about them by knowing which supermarket them and their family goes to. So that was definitely sort of the family environment, but I wouldn't say it was like a negative one. I think as someone who is maybe intellectually and spiritually inclined, even though I didn't understand at the time, I definitely felt something was missing. What is in contrast to that, and quite interesting, I think very, very common until the last decade or so, is the schools I would go to would generally, like Church of England schools, have names like St. Mary's and all these sorts of things. And depending on where we were, sometimes we're in a town, sometimes we're in a village, right? When I was in the village, when I was very young, we'd pretty much go to the village church like every day. And the teachers were maybe not so overtly, but they were pretty religious. We went to church every day. We sung hymns. Again, anyone who grew up in the UK around that time, like knows the Lord's Prayer and certain hymns. It's sort of driven into your head. But for me, I think I sort of followed in the footsteps of my parents for a long time. And again, it's going to sound really horrible to say, but I wasn't like a thinking person, I definitely wasn't a thinking person. And I had a lot of angst as well. And I'm not really sure why that was. Maybe it was that spiritual hole that I didn't even know, if you're just dropped into this world with nothing there and you're expected to admire the supermarket or something, then something's missing, but you don't particularly know why. Luckily, I kind of got out of whatever like funk that was, but it didn't take like a spiritual form until much later, I would argue. When this is very cliche, but I picked up Nietzsche when I was 16 because I was like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write like a philosophy essay for my like final college thing. So I did that and it wasn't great. I didn't understand Nietzsche, but I think it gave me something unique and maybe an aesthetic that I sort of took up. You know, it was very clear that I didn't understand Nietzsche because the first thing I did when I went to university was join the like student communists, you know. So that took up my life for another couple years. Again, reading like, you know, barely understanding the Communist Manifesto, not actually engaging with any like Marx or anything like that, just having this vague idea of, I was a virtue signaler. I was a virtue signaler with, you know, with Nietzsche, I was a virtue signaler. With this communist stuff, I was a virtue signaler. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't understand anything about it. I just thought it was just an aesthetic, you know? And again, you know, religion's still not come into it. I definitely got sucked into the very, very surface level. I wouldn't even say right wing, but like, you know, conservative stuff that was flowing around on like YouTube early on. And, you know, again, maybe this is my neuroticism, but I went completely the other direction and became some sort of benign Tory LARPer at that point. So again, I don't know. Looking back on it, I'm not a particularly impressive journey. I want to give the positive part to this story. Doing very well at the end of university, luckily, was never good at school before that, but last couple of years of university, I was like, okay, I actually have to try at something now and actually engage, which was not it was in computer science. So that led to a very good job out of university that I did very well in, like financially and I guess socially. But I definitely felt there was something missing. And I I always liked history. I guess it's probably where the Marxism stuff came in. But I just on a whim went to an open evening at Birkbeck at the University of London, and I spent a while talking to the people at the history table. And it was all, I guess London still kind of is in lots of ways, especially at the university, still very quite twee. And I had this random conversation. I just went to a couple other tables. I was like, okay, let's see what I can do for a computer science master's. Let's see what I can do. Oh, philosophy. Let's go talk to this person. I can't even remember what I discussed with the philosophy person, and I can't even remember who it was. I might have been someone who lectured me later on, but there was something I couldn't understand what they were saying. With every other person I met that evening, with the you walk up to the history department table, you have people who look like historians, history students, these sorts of things. And the conversation kind of went like the way I expected. You go up to the computer science table, you've got the nerds there. Conversation kind of went the way I expected. I was speaking to people who were trying, I guess, is it even advertising philosophy? Because I came out of that place so confused. It's the first thing I've ever come across in my life. English way is kind of like quiet desperation, right? Like everything's kind of expected and twee and normal. And then I had these weird conversations I couldn't even understand like what was going on. So I was like, this looks like a really hard problem. I'm gonna go and work out what these guys are talking about. So I did that, and it was a Pandora's box for good and for bad.
I think let's go back to the I
There's
don't
a
want
lot there. Sorry, there's a lot
there's a
there.
lot there's a lot there there's a lot there to unpack, and I don't want to miss sort of the origin itself before we work up to some of the events where you started getting into philosophy, and you like you said, started getting into Nietzsche and communism and stuff like that. But just sort of the ground for that, which stuck out to me the most, was your uh, identification of, and I think you put it really well, this identification of a not even secular household. And this idea, it's not like an active atheism. It's not like there was, your parents were like these Dawkins like figures who are like really against religion or like saying God doesn't exist and stuff like that. But more this sense of an emptiness, a vanishing, like that something has vanished,
Yeah,
and the common man or the common family is just in this vanishing. And then what appears in this vanishing is, of course, in the intellectual sort of framing, we could say that in postmodernism, we just get reduced to the historicity of our material needs or something like that, and all of the grand narrative structures are deconstructed. But how that manifests in the common family's life is which supermarket are you going to? Like
yeah,
that becomes like the main thing. And even like the concreteness and the materiality of which supermarket does your family go to? Is it Tesco? Is it Waitrose? Right? Like this distinction seems to me to be a mega important distinction to pull out, because whether or not you as a teenager were LARPing as a communist or something like that. In this story, right? Like the class difference or the class distinction, right? In whether or not you're going to Tesco or Waitrose is like it is a big one, right? Like for those who don't know, right? Like Tesco is probably the lower end of the economic spectrum. And the Waitrose probably the higher end of the economic spectrum. But what sense do you think what mark or what perspective do you think that upbringing has led you with, or left you with rather? This sort of vanishing, this emptiness where the supermarket's the main signifier for almost worth or value or meaning.
Yeah, that's the important thing to flag up is it's not like at any of those young ages that I was like, oh yeah, like it's weird how all these people talk about which supermarket they go to, and it has a spiritual and like philosophical importance to their lives. It's one of those things where these are all pieces I've collected where people will make offhand comments, and I've just now put these pieces together. It's definitely like wasn't understood in that way up until then, and I think the fortunate and unfortunate thing is actually the postmodern, simply materialist life isn't actually a bad thing for most people. I think most people are actually inclined to doing that, or maybe they're inclined to being a serf in like medieval times and these sorts of things. But I feel like if you have the inclination, either intellectual or spiritual, you will find something wanting. And such a postmodern world, it's not like you don't have these Dawkins figures prowling around, and then you sort of realize, oh, I'm going to be a Christian now. Like there's a post atheist, postmodern like emptiness to it. It's a good way that you put it there, and I think you're actually kind of very lucky if you get to a place where I feel like I've gotten to, where you do put some pieces together. Because I think like a lot of people, especially English people, British people, because they don't want to rock the boat, if they do just kind of keep going along with it, they would, maybe be where I was and not think to go to a university open evening to see what's available and that sort of stuff.
It's definitely the case that like you say, if you do have the intellectual spiritual inclination, you will find something wanting, but then it's another level to sort of specify what form that might take, right? And for you as a I'm guessing as a high school teenager coming to Nietzsche and communism specifically, do you think that was, whether or not you were LARPing, do you think that was informed by anything specific in regards to class, or anything specific in regards to signaling that you picked up in whether or not you had any attachment to the church? I know you said you had the Lord's Prayer driven into your head, for example.
Yeah.
Was there any reaction, or was there any negation of that? And maybe even coupled to that, how much of a presence did the Church of England really have, if the Lord's Prayer was drilled into your head, so to speak?
Well, I think it has more of a presence than you realize, and especially later on, like almost like a MK Ultra spy. You're almost like these feelings and these memories in you are reactivated by like code words and these sorts of things. It's coming to the Nietzsche and the communism stuff. We'll get to that, but one thing that's important when you talk about these, and I think this is true a lot of maybe not just English people, but I think lots of people, is that my family still went to church on like Easter and maybe for like Christmas service, right? And that was because, you lived in a village of 100, maybe 200 people, and everyone went there, and it was a social obligation. I think it is maybe a misstep when looking at people to say, oh, it's materialist, right? Like everyone's a capitalist or something like this. I think that social obligation, this is kind of the dark side of David Hume, I suppose. Social obligation and common life have a big part to play as well in the death of God. Like that hole is filled up by not only materialistic consumer things like what supermarket you go to, but also a combination of both of them. I mean, the extreme of social obligation is, yes, okay, everyone in your village goes to church, so the family still goes for the big services, right? But then you have a weird combination in the middle where you have a mixture of consumerism and social obligation. For example, where people will watch the same television show or watch the same game show and vote on it and things, so they have an opinion to have on that non-political, non-spiritual mechanism and have something to talk about by the water cooler. I do think it's a simplification and misstep to say it's just It's just materialism. Getting onto the Nietzsche stuff and the communism stuff, like I honestly, like I think this is like early YouTube days. So I definitely was watching like Hitchens clips and Dawkins clips and that sort of stuff, watching Sam Harris destroy creationists and all that good stuff. And I think that I, was probably on like some atheist forum or something and heard the name Nietzsche and got a copy and flicked through it. But again, like that and the Marx I did read, like I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what I was reading. I think I didn't even know that at the time. Like, but looking back on it, it was like a purely aesthetic thing. It was a purely aesthetic thing. I didn't understand this stuff, especially when
And what was beautiful about it? What was aesthetic about it?
Oh, I don't mean that I find it is aesthetic now. I think I was being a poser as a teenager and as a young man. I think I was being a poser, and it was clear the first time I got into any sort of conversation at university with someone who actually read any of this stuff. It was very clear that I was just might have had a bit of brains on me, but there was no substance to back it up. It was completely obvious.
Right. So like, but when you're a teenager, when you're posing, what did you find aesthetically attractive about Nietzsche and communism? Was there anything about it in specific that even if you didn't understand it intellectually, that there was an aesthetic draw to it of some kind?
Yeah, I think that the Nietzsche stuff is, I mean, like, I think it was honestly as shallow as, oh, this is what intellectual people read. But the communism stuff definitely has an aesthetic draw to it. In the same way that this is gonna be controversial. I feel like the stuff that Albert Speer did under the mid-century Germans there's a beauty in it. There's a beauty in some of these things. There's a beauty in a big rally, but there's also there's a beauty in some of the films of the Chinese Social Revolution or some of the propaganda films that the Soviets made. These have an aesthetic quality to them. And and again, I think, I watched a lot of documentaries about communism on early YouTube, definitely. And it had an aesthetic draw for me. And then it has, it definitely overlapped with kind of the end of New Labour going into what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, which was kind of, that's probably the last time I would have identified in that direction. But yeah, I mean, it's true to this day. You have a conversation with someone who's intellectually or spiritually minded, and if they haven't actually read this stuff and engaged with the material. If they've just been watching video essays and YouTube documentaries. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Sometimes, if I don't feel like reading, I'll watch a documentary, especially if someone's recommended it. But I don't think this wasn't always the case, but there's definitely like an elitism to actually reading the books that people talk about and actually engaging with the material. And I think it's become ever more true. Like, especially lots of people think that you're able to find everything on the internet, which is not true. Like, especially like later on with some of the actual robust work that I'm proud of I did for my books, is that a lot of the stuff I'm referencing, like you have to find stuff that's out of print, stuff that has like no reviews, no pictures of it anywhere, because no one's read this stuff for a very long time. But especially in the case of the work I did on Philo and the ancient skeptics, like no one had. I bought these books that were like 40 years old, and on top of that, it was clear that no one had ever opened it. And that's clear with a lot of. I mean, I think most of the books I checked out of university libraries and actually started reading would have, I guess, maybe less than, depending on how new they were, I'd say they would have definitely less than 10 checkouts. And anyone who's, even if you're trying to read the books in the university library, that when you check out a book, you don't necessarily read it. There's a real elitism to this, and I think it's both a sad thing and a kind of
Right.
it's a double-edged sword, that one, I think.
The void or the picture I'm getting from your life narrative there is, first I just want to point towards what I sense of this general breakdown of social obligation and common life, from people going to church once a week to people going to church for main events of the year, like Easter and Christmas, to then people not going to church at all. Like my family didn't go to church at all. Right. So I feel like there's this breakdown of course, traditional common life and social obligation that again, gradually opens up this void. And whether or not we can see that as a good thing or a bad thing, whether we want to see that as historically necessary or some sort of form of social decay, I think we could discuss a little bit about that. But
I'm interested just to address something you said there, actually, because
sure.
the church thing is apt, and we can't ignore the religious question. It's very important, but like the coming back, the supermarket thing just I think fits so many personal experiences for me. But there's a phrase, I don't know if you know this phrase, but in like British culture, there's a phrase called the big shop. Have you ever heard this before?
I have
So there's
not.
it's definitely like my parents' generation, which is like Gen X probably, but they have this expression like the big shop, and it means like that's the shop you do like once or every 2 weeks, where you drive from your suburban, maybe on a tube line if you're lucky, I don't know, suburban house to the out of town supermarket, and you do your like 1 week's 2 weeks shopping. And I just it's I've heard it so many people, so many British people use this, like so many British people use this, like, oh, like someone ask a question about food or something, I'd be like, oh, I don't know, my wife does the big shop or whatever. And like it's replaces that sort of stuff. And you say like your family never went to church, fine, but I'm interested. What did you? Was there anything that replaced that? Because I feel like the big shop replaced that for a lot of the suburban Gen X generation in the UK.
I think for my family it was just family dinners, or we would have sometimes Sunday dinners with the larger extended family. So I think it was more extended family events. Certainly on Christmas and Easter and big events of the year, there was always an extended family gathering. So in some sense that was church,
Yeah,
but there was no need for like there was no inclination even in my direct family or extended family. There was just there was just no inclination towards church or religious belief. So I really did have like almost a pure secular upbringing in some sense because there was just no conversation about it. I didn't really feel like I didn't even feel like it was missing so much
yeah.
as it just wasn't there. And I didn't come to those questions personally until much later.
Yeah, I feel
But
like we that's something we share, I think.
right. So there's there is this general turn to secularity where I guess you could say the main consequence of that is that there isn't this social obligation to all go to the same place every week. And there is this breakdown to, I guess, on the first level, the extended family, on the second level, the nuclear family, and then on the third level, the individual, and just that gradual breaking down into the individual. And what you're saying about the big shop sort of replacing the church experience, I guess that would be best expressed on the level of the nuclear family, like the wife or the husband or the family goes out to the big shop every once or twice a week. Now, the interesting thing I would be wanting to ask you, because you said in regards to David Hume's notion of common life that there's this idea that the social obligation is kind of it's not even really something that's that desirable. But I'd be interested to know, like, do you think this breakdown from, let's say, a traditional communal life where everyone's going to church every week towards this division down to individualism, do you see more positive, emancipatory potential in that tendency? Or do you see more of a retroactive, we need to reclaim that substance mentality?
Yeah. I think there's two factors to that. Whether it's going to give you stability or liberate you depends on the type of person you are, like what your constitution is as a person, firstly. And number two, I think it's important to say there are good types of individuality, bad types of individuality, good types of common life, and bad types of common life, right? Now it's more of a moral question. I'm not saying it's like a scientific thing to say, oh, this is a bad type of common life, because we could easily think of, like, maybe a good example would be like mega churches in the US, which maybe that's a bad bad version of that common life. But maybe the nice little Church of England church in the village where all the old people can go and say hi to each other and have a cup of tea and all that. That's seems quite, if a bit twee for me, is quite nice. And then yeah, individuality, that goes both directions as well. Like you've got individuality to break away from maybe what you found repressive about where you came from. Maybe it allows you to enhance yourself personally, spiritually, or intellectually. But also what we're dealing with now, maybe it'll get so individual that no one will be having babies and we'll be playing video games and watching pornography, and we'll disregard common life so much you get past childbearing age and you wonder why something's missing. That's the dark side of it. So again, I think, and this is maybe I think we disagreed on this in the past, but I'm definitely not, I wouldn't say, yes, I'm definitely not an egalitarian, but I think that also ties into the fact that different people have different constitutions and different needs, perhaps. I think for me personally, maybe I'm kind of, yes, I think I'm very lucky to come where I come from because although I'm, again, like I'm saying, I'm trying to respect my family here. Like it's, although for me, post hoc, and maybe if at the time, if I had the, perspective, I would have realized that it's missing these one things. But it doesn't mean it was devoid of love. I don't. For better, I think a lot of people, even people who are so deracinated, family is like the last bulwark that we have in that regard. And I think that's a positive thing. The family you do have, that's a really positive thing. But I think it is liberating to have institutions like universities. And I suppose that's why you and me talk and care about them so much, even though we consider ourselves post-academic, is because, in many ways, maybe we share the fact that it was, some of these things became like a liberation for us, especially if you come from, very twee parts of England where no one really talks about anything beyond like the village fete, So yes, I think there's several sides. I don't know how much we agree on there, at least conceptually, but I think that's truly what I think from what I've experienced in my life.
Where we definitely do agree is on the contradictory nature of individuality and community, or individuality and common life, that I think that there's trade-offs here, that there are trade-offs, like you're saying, good and bad individuality, good and bad forms of common life. So where I sort of tend to draw the line in terms of my own personal engagement with these things, is just the absolute reification of one over the other. I think in the absolute reification of one over the other, we lose, like, for example, just saying, we need to absolutely return to common life over the individual, or we just need to identify with the individual over common life. I think that there's a more complex picture at work here. But I do think that the tendency towards but I do see a historical tendency, which is a tendency that is moving asymmetrically towards the individual. And as you say, when you have that asymmetrical tendency and that movement towards the individual, and to me, it's just a philosophical question. What is the fate of that tendency? Is it, like you're saying, is it this movement towards the end of reproduction?
Yeah.
Or is it something that needs to be correctively balanced in some sort of dialectical opposition or some dialectical oscillation, where we will restore some nature of common life, which may not look like common life in a 19th century England or 19th century pre-industrial society, but rather takes on a different form. And that's where some of the more secular thinking about communitarianism may be interesting, just as a speculative, just to entertain it speculatively about how do we reinvent community life? What does the reinvention of community life look like? And could we make it more reflexive in regards to the function, which seems to be about the reproduction of the species? So I guess there's a few questions there, or a few topics there, but one of them is this asymmetrical movement towards individualism, where you have the erosion of the capacity to reproduce the species. And you would be an interesting person to get that point of view on, because you're living in Korea now. And Korea is one of these centers of reproductive decline.
I don't disagree with you. The move over the last, I guess maybe since the Renaissance, probably, is definitely towards the individual. I wouldn't disagree with you there. I think at least currently that pull's being done by global liberalism, probably, mostly. Maybe you can call that capital if you want to be a bit more Marxist with it, perhaps. But I think the danger is it goes against our human nature. Our human nature, we are social animals. And so we are, I would say, naturally inclined towards things that appeal to common life. And my argument is that although there should be avenues for individualism for certain people, I think the majority of our efforts should be made to keep us more towards homogeneity and common life. The reason why I think this is actually a good thing, this is the good thing for people, even people who do favor their individuality, is that I think that human biology will rebel against that extreme individualism, and actually already has in a lot of ways. you'll see people who are going to react in perverse ways, whether that's political, scientific, or whatever. Like the human biology is going to rebel against that individual. We just can't exist as atomized beings. We just can't exist as atomized beings. And if we do, then maybe it is the death of the species. Although my thinking on the this is again a bit of a tangent, but my thinking on the birth rate stuff, taking a step back and thinking about it from first principles, I don't think it's as big of an issue as our knee-jerk reaction to it is. And I'm not going as far to say like, oh no, the extinction of the species isn't a big deal. That is a big deal. But I don't think a reduction in global population, or at least nations' population specifically, actually, is a particularly negative thing. In fact, that would possibly alleviate some of the problems we have. Scarcity of certain resources, I suppose in the West, I'm specifically talking about housing, not necessarily things like food, although the last couple of years have been a bit strange in that regard. To give an example, actually, there's a very strong argument, I believe, that the reduction of the European population of just over a third due to successive plagues there's an argument to say that kick-started the Renaissance. Now, whether you think the results of the Renaissance are a good or a bad thing, like it's not necessarily true that there's less people around. It's the end of the world. That's ridiculous because it clearly hasn't been in the past. Like again, to give a even smaller example, the reason why Tudor England did so well, especially as it got moving into the British Empire, is because Britain just, for whatever reason, I guess it was harvests and things like this, just had a natural population decline throughout the Tudor period. So wealth centralized in less and less hands, who were then able to invest in things like colonies and these sorts of things. The wages of average people, like the average peasant, like again, people talking about the 1950s in America, but the average peasant had like a wife and how many kids and a little plot of land and stuff. And it's like, hey, people talk about how bad it was to be a peasant. I don't know if that sounds too bad these days, especially a nice plot of land somewhere in England, rural England, doesn't sound too bad. So yes, to just reflect on the birth rate thing, I hope me and my friend Owen will have another conversation about this because I've got some things to say about this. But I think the knee-jerk reaction is as a result of the fact that we're ensconced in global liberal ideology, which for whatever reason has a religious, we talked about this already, has a religious obsession with GDP, which America's still going up, right? But it has no reflection on the quality of life or the quality of individual person or people's spiritual development for sure. And in fact, this is probably a more rightist thought actually, is I don't think that if a nation didn't have essentially open borders like a lot of Western nations at least pretty much do or are moving towards now, like I don't see how population reduction is a necessarily bad thing at all. I just don't see why that is. Now, if you're looking at a global scale, where we've got to manage these things as a technocratic elite, then it's a different question, right? Which is why maybe the alarmism's going the other direction. But I don't know if we disagree on that stuff, but that's what my thoughts on that have been recently, at least.
No, I mean it's a fascinating topic, and the question that's coming to my mind, or the one that's most alive for me in the context of your story, is I would like to bring it back around to how when you were a teenager you gravitated towards communist literature, and then now in your sort of present sort of mode of thinking, it seems like the global neoliberal ideology is sort of the main source of negativity in your worldview. And how does that interface, or how has that developed? How has your initial sort of perhaps superficial readings of communism, and of course Marxist ideology being grounded in class difference and class antagonism, coupled with sort of childhood experiences of, which supermarket are you going to, the Tesco or the Waitrose? How does that, do you think, inform the way you're seeing global neoliberal ideology and its effects on common life and our capacity to actually be humans and sort of engage in, like, perhaps what Marx would call the species being?
Yeah. Yeah. This is probably one of my more controversial opinions, but I expect, especially intellectual people, they post hoc rationalize things. And frankly, again, you've dropped a bunch of Marxist terminology there, half of which I don't even know, really. Like I don't think I understood these things, and I think
well, instead of species being, we could just say the common life. Like I think that's what I read in your
sure.
perspective is like
Yes,
our capacity to engage in common life has been eroded by global neoliberal ideology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, maybe. Okay. I want to push forward something. I think the urge is a thinking intellectual person is you want to rationalize things in terms of theory and politics and maybe make a coherent story here. Frankly, I think it's down to temperament. Like I would say I'm a very neurotic person, um, and highly neurotic people tend to be very extremely religious or political. And not only that, but they tend to flip flop over the course of their lives as to what their opinions are, which is why it seems to have done a complete 180. Now, another aspect of my personality is I think I'm very high in disagreeableness. Now, someone who's very agreeable might be more of a liberal leftist, perhaps. But I think the attraction towards the tanky sort of end of things might have been the fact that are just completely disagreeable. Oh, these people are the bad people, that sort of thing. And maybe, maybe my rants about global elite are because oh, these are the oppressors now. I'm completely open to that, and I think that I would love to give you a really well thought out philosophical and well read answer to that. But I think that is the most obvious explanation from where I'm sitting. Maybe that discounts me as a thinker. I don't know, but that's just me being honest about it. To be honest with you.
No, I mean, I think that the whole relationship between, on the one end, over rationalization, over intellectualization, and on the
Mm,
other end, saying coming down, no, it comes down to temperament. It comes down to the personality type, or it comes down to the psychological structure of the individual.
yeah.
I think that we need to have a conversation about how these are interacting within everyone, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think, at least from my point of view, I don't think anyone escaped, whether or not you have some sort of tendency to neurosis or psychosis or perversion or these different clinical structures.
Yeah.
Like you said, I'm a very neurotic person, and neurotic people do have this tendency to an extreme of religiosity or political orientation, like you were saying. I don't think we can pretend that this is irrelevant or separated. I
Yeah.
think it's fundamentally connected. But maybe what I want to highlight there then in regards to your personal story is, what is the nature of this complete 180? When you say you had the initial sort of aesthetic, superficial attraction to communism without any of the whatever theory, doesn't matter. Then there was a complete 180 towards a different position, but it's still deeply grounded in political economy. And what is the nature of this 180 in your point of view? What is the nature of this flip-flopping?
Yeah. It sounds like the 180 was very sudden, but it wasn't actually. It was over a number of years, to be completely fair. Yeah, definitely went from being some definitely uninformed tanky to actually reading a little bit of something and being more of like I guess a Jeremy Corbyn kind of left winger, disengaging from politics for a while. I said benign conservative, but I think I was definitely more influenced by some of the stuff that was going on online in terms of like the more libertarian right in America, I'd say. And then like a lot of people who have taken the path through the libertarian right have sort of ended up in a more righteous position. I honestly think, and there's especially if you're a journalist, you're writing about how people are being radicalized by the internet, but I think it's kind of true, man. I think the internet, like especially YouTube and stuff, has done a lot to giving that kind of foot in the door for people who are kind of maybe slightly intellectually inclined but have not read anything particularly deep. And I think that can have good and bad effects, like having that intellectual foot in the door and being able to watch and listen to lectures on Nietzsche on YouTube and finally actually understanding some of it has led to, some productive work for me, but it's also led to some political nonsense and confusion, which is anyone who's spoken to anyone who's, their idea of rightism or conservatism is informed by what they've seen on YouTube knows how retarded and silly that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of radicalization, and I don't think we can avoid that just in terms of how much information is available today. I mean, 20 years ago, you would have to go to a university library to access a lot of the material that now is a Google search away. Almost any book I put in with the title of the book and a PDF as the search term will lead me to finding the book I want within one or two searches. So it's absurd the amount of information that's accessible to everyone today, and that is going to be causing a lot of political radicalization and potentially confusion, especially if that material is not being taught in some sort of human modeling way, like where there's actually teacher and student relationships, right? A lot of people are basically becoming autodidacts without like in the past, if you learned a lot of that information, it would be in the context of a teacher-student relationship, or be in the context of actually engaging and reading with other people, perhaps book clubs. So I do think that a lot of what needs to happen today, and I had this conversation with Anna Kornblue recently on the channel about immediacy as the style of too late capitalism, where we can just immediately get access to all this information. But what's needed are new structures of mediation where we can have human to human relationships and teacher student relationships where people can actually learn these things in relationship to someone who's spent, let's say, 10 years with the text or something like that. And in part, I'm trying to construct Philosophy Portal to play that role of mediation, but of course it requires an ecology of such entities in order to really make it more robust. But yeah, in short, yeah, there is this temptation towards radicalization online. But you didn't just stay, I don't think, and I want to emphasize this for the viewers, you didn't just stay in a shallow or a superficial intellectual engagement with, let's
No.
say, a Nietzsche or other political thinkers. You did, in this turn, end up tackling these things in a more long form mediation. And when did that flip? When did you start taking philosophy more? When did it start to deepen for you? And what were some of the important markers along that road to deepening in regards to your journey?
Yeah. So the obvious one I've already mentioned is the fact that I, started doing a master's in philosophy part-time. That opens up a lot of doors, but I think there's a lot of issues I've spoken about in the past of philosophy 101 courses where they take a couple of pages of Hume and you talk about that one week, and it's not really a holistic study of these things. Biggest thing, and I think this was a real door opener, something that again, I think the way I've described myself is like a fairly, like, not very well read, not a very thinking person, all these sorts of things. But I think it was the invitation to write philosophically, and again, I think this is where I do have a question for you on your project, actually, because I think it's relevant. But it was reading philosophers, obviously Nietzsche. When I actually went back to Nietzsche and read full books, especially works like The Gay Science, which have like poetry and songs in them, along with stuff like, and again, for where I ended up, you'd never think this, but the Frankfurt School, definitely. So Foucault, definitely Adorno, and then coming round to someone like Nick Land and his book on Bataille, just absolutely rocking my world. Like I've never had a book where I would race home after work to read it all night and read it like 3 times in a row. Like it was insane. Like, and it wasn't just like, oh, because I read great books in the past, great novels, stuff like that. But it wasn't just that. It was like, oh, someone can write philosophy like this. And so I started writing my university essays. I wouldn't say not as good as Nietzsche, not as good as Nick Land, that's for sure. But I started getting a bit more conversational with it, and it opened this door to a creativity that had, for whatever reason, again, you've been talking about like what connection this has to like early life. I don't know, man. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. But it opened this door to creativity, which had been, for whatever reason, been completely shut off my entire life. Like writing philosophically was the door to my creativity, which I never had. I never had a creative bone in my body. Never had anything creative in my body. And that sort of writing doesn't do so well in university. So I did all right at my master's, but I didn't, do as well as I did at the, rigorous logic of computer science, where you could follow some rules and do well, right? But what it did prompt me to do is starting to write of my own accord. And that led to my writings online. It led to my books. And I've had some wonderful compliments from people like yourself saying that, oh, there's a distinct style to this. It's conversational. This is interesting. And those were some big bits of encouragement when I was, starting out doing this a few years ago. It was a really, really big bit of encouragement. So I really appreciate that from you. But so in a weird sense, Birkbeck, the school I went to in London, they are a great philosophy school, and I would recommend it to people who are looking for. I would recommend it to people because they've got some great lecturers. But I do consider, I'd say Nietzsche, Foucault, Adorno, and then finally Land in terms of my philosophical journey and then my creativity, they were my mentors in terms of actually unlocking that final door. Which is interesting because it contrasts with what you've been talking about. I know you've probably done a lot more thinking about this because you're actually trying to start this in the real world, meet space and online. Your description of a teacher or mentor almost sounds like a mediator, or on the negative side, perhaps a gatekeeper. I'm just kind of wondering, what do you think, what is the normative place of a teacher or mentor in your view, at least?
It's a challenge for our current world, and this has been when I say a challenge for our current world, I'm talking about a span of centuries. It's been a challenge for our current world to reconcile itself with the place of authority. Authority in the pre-modern world had a type of givenness to it. Authority in the pre-modern world had a type of transcendental reification to it and a transcendental justification to it, which the authority does not have anymore. So I think that, at least for me, the place of a teacher or a mentor or a mediator is indispensable for the cultivation of a mind, but the way in which we institute it or the way in which we encourage it, I think itself has to change. For me, the principle that I embody at Philosophy Portal is that I'm not trying to force anyone to come to Philosophy Portal. I basically am sitting and waiting patiently. I have something to teach, and if people come, then I can play that role. So it's basically a more passive waiting game approach that I think for those who are seeking it, it's there, but I'm not going to enforce or impose it on anyone. So it's more of an inverted disposition or an inverted posture. But I think that what the potential of that role can have in students' lives is just to function as a structuring moment so that one does not get overwhelmed, or that one does not overemphasize the immediacy of whatever bright ideas come to their mind when they first read a Nick Land or when they first read a Nietzsche, because oftentimes those impressions can be very important, but they don't reach their maturity
Yeah.
until they've been discussed or until they've been reflected with someone who sat with that text for a longer period of time. Anyway, that would be my I don't know what thoughts are coming to your mind, but that would be my response.
No, it's fascinating because I think that that structuring moment, again, it's coming back to my fact that I think people are really different sometimes. Like for some people, the structuring moments that happen in a rigid university course are really great for them, and that gets them what they want. But yeah, my experience was I was having all these ideas. I was my first idea for my dissertation was like, oh, I want to write about free will, but I want to talk about how free will is a religious concept, and I'm gonna do it through the lens of epic poetry and talk about how free will is used in Dante and Milton and Homer. And you can probably imagine what free will university professor thought about that sort of idea, and quickly recommended one of his own papers, one of his own books, and some other thing he'd done some research on, and say, oh, no, you should read these books and come back and tell me what you think about it. And I think that maybe that is somewhere for the legacy university to go, and I guess ultimately this is what legacy university has become, because they do sell themselves on like employability and stuff. I don't know what place the philosophy department has in the modern university, which is essentially a trade school really these days, especially with the fees and stuff. I think what you're doing is much more in the nature of philosophy, but I think it will appeal to the few. I don't think it appeals to the many to not have that hand holding. I'm just interested. One thing that stuck out when you were just talking about mentors was the phrase transcendental justification. What do you mean by that? And what do you mean that which kind of transcendental justification was there in the past? How did it disappear? And what sort of thing will that look like in the future? Are you talking about academic authority, or am I missing the point?
Well, I was talking about authority in the broadest concept. It could apply to the university, it could
Right,
apply
yeah.
to the church, it could apply to
Yeah.
the state, it could apply to the monarch. So I was more talking about like a paradigmatic mode of the way human beings were, almost like a certain nature of a historical epoch maybe in a Heideggerian type of sense. But I just wanted to say before answering your question that I think that the university and the university professor does a great disservice to students when they try to fit the student within their model of what they think is right, as opposed to functioning as what I would call a vanishing mediator towards birthing themselves. I think
Yeah.
the structuring moment should be towards birthing themselves as opposed to fitting a mold up for a specific type of employment ultimately is the justification for the, as you said, the legacy university. So hopefully Philosophy Portal is able to live up to that ideal of birthing as opposed to fitting into a certain mold. But where transcendental justification came from, in my understanding, is the reification of a supernatural other world, reification of a certain type of eternity, which either a philosopher or a king or a priest or a pope had some sort of direct connection to. So it was this, like for example, in Europe, it would be called the divine right of kings, right? So the king was the king. Why? Ultimately, because of some sort of transcendental supernatural necessity, which when that is removed, you just get this bare contingency where it's, well,
Yeah.
why is that king the king? Well, there's no actual reason for that king to be the king. There's no reason that family is the family. There's no
Yeah.
reason why that teacher is the teacher. And so I think that is what the modern world has removed. And that's what the modern world struggles with in regards to authority, because it ultimately authority is abyssal. And that's sort of where the underlying logic of Abyssal Arrows, the anthology which you're also published in,
Exactly. Yeah.
the idea of Abyssal Arrows is to think through spiritual leadership, but to think through spiritual leadership in a more of an abyssal way, which I do think Nietzsche leads to, because Nietzsche is not trying to get followers. Nietzsche's trying to birth children. So that brings me back to sort of the principle at Philosophy Portal. It's much more birthing children model than it is creating followers model.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the issue with most philosophy professors, I think that's because I think most of us are pretty self-obsessed people, is the fact that, and this was my, like I described my experience, they want to fit you into their research project. It's not like I'm going to foster this person's own creativity or, 90-degree outlook on things. And I think your idea about the transcendental justification there is apt. And I think it comes back to what I'm saying about the bad side of common life as well. Like there are issues with all types of transcendental justification by the very nature of the fact that it's heaven and the police control heaven and these sorts of things. The social nature of man has rebelled against that disappear of the transcendental justification and propped it back up in perverse ways, like whether people are checking the crypto markets or the stock markets, or they're checking the COVID numbers or the number of deaths in Gaza or the number of deaths in Ukraine. And that's their metric for how well the world is going.
That's a really creative reinvention of the propping up of a transcendental justification. But even in that situation, and I think that's actual, I think that's happening. That's a fact of history. I would say that that transcendental justification is itself historical, right? It's in the crypto markets, it's in the deaths in Gaza. Those are historical sort of transcendental justifications. And I think that's where we get the intersection between, and this is also, I think, structuring modern philosophy, is we get the idea of not just a eternal transcendental and not just a historicization, but
Right. Yeah.
the coincidence between the transcendental and the historical.
Okay. Yeah.
Like and then you get the, again, like the analysis of whatever your transcendental horizon as the crypto markets and stuff like this.
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating way of looking. The word I picked out from that, and actually looking at some of Seneca's work, I've written an essay called Eternal Thinking, which is looking at this question from the perspective of what it means for people who are intellectually minded. And a lot of intellectualism has become, the tweet cycle has become, what opinion can I have on the latest AI art generator or whatever? Like, what philosophical implications does that have? But I think that, and this is what you will do if you're fostering people as opposed to guiding them, it will lead to eternal ideas and eternal thinking. I'm just wondering if that non, okay, or at least the eternal that plays with the historical, do you think that's the same thing that human beings of all types across all times have called God? Do you think that's the same thing?
Well, I think people in different cultural historical constellations have different theories about God. I think many people's theories about God take roughly a Platonic form, even if that Platonic form is maybe too much of a simplification of Plato. But basically, what I mean by the Platonic form is what my own grandmother told me when I was a kid, which is that when you die, you go back to where you came from. And you came from this supernatural world. You came from this world of perfect forms. So you came from the world of perfect forms and you're going to return to the world of perfect form. And that, I think, sutures or in some sense guarantees the historical mind of some safety, of some security, of some sort of meaning and belonging in a transcendental sense. I think
Yeah,
that this idea of the eternity that plays with the historical is actually quite disturbing for most people. I think it
mm,
actually disrupts most people. I think for most people to for people to bring to reflexive consciousness that the eternal is playing with the historical is something people recoil from in horror. It's something that's deeply unsettling. So I think that idea is something which actually most religious people would see as a form of atheism.
sure. Okay. Yeah. I suppose maybe what I was trying to get at is the fact that that idea of the eternal, like you said, different cultures, different peoples, takes different forms and are different theories that I would say are trying to reach out in our very kind of broken human way, trying to reach out to this eternal perfect thing again. They're all attempts to do that, I think. But I suppose we each have.
But that would be a way in which the eternal gets reified in the historical towards a future necessary telos. Like for example, the person playing with the crypto markets thinking that the crypto is going to lead to some sort of economic utopia,
Yeah,
or the person paying attention to the deaths in Gaza thinking that eventually we're going to have some sort of I don't know, emancipatory uprising against the Israeli state or something like that. But just the point is that there, I think that's another idea of the historical and the eternal, which I think Marx is playing with, which is this idea that there's going to be a future heaven on earth, or there's going to be, and that future heaven on earth could be the agents of communism, the world proletariat, or that could be through blockchain technology enabling sort of a stateless withering of the state, and we have all these trust networks which open up the ideal economy or something like that, or even transhumanists who think that we're eventually going to be able to transcend our body, either going to be able to transcend our body or going to be able to perfect our body through genetic engineering. So all of these different forms are ways in which the eternal becomes reified as a future historical moment. Now, I think Nick Land has a more dystopian view on this, which is that the future historical moment is actually going to be our destruction. We're going to be destroyed by the AI capital god or something like that.
yeah. I think telos and eschatology, I suppose, are are key to metaphysics. Whether you're talking about I guess essentially dialectical materialist metaphysics, or whether you're talking about weird, I guess politicized, but still metaphysical in a sense, like libertarian ANCAP Bitcoin maximalist eschatology, you know? But what I find interesting is that there are different types of eschatology in terms of how they view time. I've had some really interesting conversations with Bethany Tabor, who's an astrologist, and she's got some interesting views on time and calendars and stuff. Way deeper into that than me. But my view essentially is that you do have linear views of times and you do have cyclical views of times. Now, I've had some pushback from Buddhists on this, but I think it's fair to say that Buddhism and some other Eastern philosophies have a largely cyclical view of time. And this is in contrast. And I think this is the reason actually why things like Hegelianism, communism, libertarianism in a sense, I suppose, and come out of the Western tradition, because I think that Christianity is very linear in its telos. Now, whether you connect it to the historical, I don't know, but at the end of the day, at least if you take the canon as prescribed by most churches, we're going, we've had the resurrection and we are now in the waiting period before revelation. And it's okay, that's not a utopia on earth. In fact, quite the opposite on earth. But that is a time when we will be judged and then, either been thrown into eternal damnation or be at one and one with the Holy Father. I don't know what you think about that. If you think that connection is correct or apt, but
No,
I find that.
I have a similar interpretation that a lot of Eastern philosophies tend towards a cyclical view of time, and
Yeah,
actually the Western tradition does break from that circle, and it's kind of introducing a future that's very different from the past, and in that sense takes at least temporarily the form of a line, because the idea of a cyclical view of history would have no metaphysical space for something like the resurrection, let alone revelation, because that
that's
would suggest a break in the circle, and that would suggest that something in the future would be very different from something in the past. And so I do think that modern philosophies, like I do, whether it's Hegelianism to libertarianism, there is a way in which those are uniquely Western in that sense. But I would like to bring it back around to the historical and the personal, because I do think that our moment is one of reprocessing the Christian and reprocessing the Christian metaphysics. And I know that's something that you have had some contact with yourself. So, what ideas are going through your head in this moment, and how has Christianity reappeared for you? Because when we met, and of course when I read your work for the first time, Nietzsche and the ideas of the iconoclast could be seen as very anti-Christian in a sense, and even opposed to Christianity in a sense. So, how has this interfaced with your philosophical project?
yeah. Yeah, I think I think if you were to like pin me down on something philosophical for a long time, you can tell this from the iconoclast. Like, it is definitely skepticism, but skepticism only really goes so far. And I cover this in the iconoclast. I talk about the limits, the possibility of even thinking in that sort of way. That unbounded way that doesn't have any precognition, any axioms, and these sorts of things. And that's in contrast to what we're talking about with common life, social obligation, all these things. They have prerequisite ideologies, have prerequisites as well. All these things have prerequisites. They have axioms that hold them somewhere, making them dogmatic ultimately in positive and negative ways. One thing the iconoclast did give me, and it took me a long time to get here for such a small admission, it took me a long time to get there, is the one thing I could say for certain, and this is going to sound so basic to some people who are well read and are better thinkers than me, but it gave me one assertion, which was that there was a metaphysical reality. There is one. Of all the possibilities there is one, right? It doesn't matter if that's, some sort of nihilism, whether revelation is on the way, or whether dialectical materialism is true. I don't know. But I started to call this thing God. And I used to say, oh, I believe in this thing. It's God. It's whatever the metaphysical truth is. And that was, in a philosophical way, a foot in the door out of abject skepticism, which is great and fun if you're intellectually, like, you want to have conversations and stuff. But those things go in circles for a long time. And I think, people spend their whole lives babbling about that sort of stuff and not really getting anywhere. But it gave me the foot in the door. And so from that, I think, again, lots of people who are spiritually minded but don't really know what to do with that energy, always interested. Like, I was interested, even when I was a skeptic, I was interested in reading the Bible, because it's just so important to philosophy. Like, I feel like you have to kind of know the Bible pretty well to really understand Western philosophy. I don't think that's unfair to say. I think you do. That's true. So that's why I was interested in actually engaging with that scripture. And then obviously, people call it mindfulness or whatever, which I think is a horrible bit of marketing. But there is a long tradition of those sorts of things, like meditation or prayer, which I really believe is a form of meditation, realizing there's strange connections between these things. The rosary and Buddhist prayer beads, like, there's no like functional difference to the biological animal that we are in terms of the function that and prayer and meditation plays. This is where we get out of the philosophical and into the personal, and possibly a little bit political, But having certain, and lots of people, I think this is a real shame, because I do think that lots of people have drug-induced experiences and think they're spiritual, even though they were just confusing. I think that's kind of a pretty big epidemic right now, unfortunately. Again, among the people I'm talking about, intellectually or spiritually inclined, lost people, basically. I have no way to describe what I consider myself and some of these other people, really. But through not through these drug-induced experience, but just plain meditation and going deeper and deeper into that experience, and not pretending like I was some guru. And every time I prayed or every time I meditated, I had some sort of deep life changing experience, or that I was in nirvana or something like that. But the occasional time when the setting is just right, your body is, for whatever reason, in just the right homeostasis, there's no distractions, and you start to understand what it means to be without the treadmill in your mind and constant desire. And those, again, I really hope I'm not talking nonsense to you. I don't know if you've had any similar experiences that are non-drug induced. I'm not exactly against drugs or anything. I'm just saying that I think a lot of that energy is thinking that's enlightenment. That's a misanalysis of a lot of that stuff. Although I don't think that's not a way to be spiritual. I just want to say that. But what I'm saying is that, like, without that chemical inducement, having those sorts of experiences where you feel at peace with who you are as a person, when for so long, like you said, maybe this is my neuroticism, like for a moment, a very brief moment, not feeling completely neurotic. And I've had some amazing experiences like that, but very rarely, but very rarely. And then realizing that, I'm not too proud. And I think this is what keeps a lot of people in that skeptical, postmodern, perhaps even space where they lean towards what supermarket they go to, or they lean towards what political party they support. All these earthly things that are not that godly eternal that I think we're speaking about. And realizing that I'm not too proud to think that I can't just believe something. And then from that point, going and being like, well, okay. And people do look at it in the wrong way. What they do is they go to Barnes and Nobles or Waterstones, and they buy one copy of the Quran, one copy of the Bible. And they're like, let's go. Like, again, we're back to consumerism. Back to the supermarket and picking out which new fashion is right for me. And it came back to the body. And this is definitely more of a political thing to say, particularly in the current time. But I think it's the positive side of the rightist, particularist impulse is that again, we can get back to Freud and my early childhood experiences. I've always had I've had the greatest affinity for Christianity. At times I've ran from that, but that's the truth. I feel most spiritually at home when I'm in a church, and particularly when I'm in a Church of England church in a small village. But you can find Anglican services all over the world, and that feels the most right to me. And I think that is something true, not on an abstract philosophical level, but frankly on an ethnos level. Like, there is a history with my people, and I mean, how much credence you put in this is up to you. But I think it's a pretty good indicator. Like, doing my ancestry and realizing that I'm like 90% Anglo with like a little bit of Danish. So some Viking got in me at some point. But realizing that I'm an Anglo. I'm completely Anglo, and whatever things, the spiritual things that are in that land are also in you in terms of ethnos, and that's your biological makeup, but it's also your cultural makeup. And I don't think it's irrational, because humans are irrational, but that is what appeals to me. And I do think that, maybe if I go and become a Buddhist monk, I'd find some sort of spirituality. But I think at the end of the day, that would be LARPing. Being anything that you're not in terms of ethnos is LARPing, I ultimately think. I think it's correct for an Anglo to want to be in England and to want to do things in English ways. Now, what that
So
means for a
why are you in
proposition
Korea?
nation, like, job opportunities, that's why. England will always, so this is the thing, is
Capital.
England will always be my home. England will always be my home.
All right, so there's a lot there that I'd be interested to unpack, but like the
There is
main
a
thing,
lot there. There is a lot
yeah,
there.
the main thing though, at least to me, is you're coming, and I totally agree with you, by the way, about you can't pick your religious orientation by buying a Bible and a Quran and another, and then just reading them all intellectually and then coming to a determination.
I think if you're going to be properly human, it's going to come to you in an irrational way,
Yeah,
and in a
or
way
like you're
that
saying,
it
coming back
just
to the
feels
body.
right. Yeah, it just feels right. For better or for worse.
Right. And I do think that childhood is going to inform this. I mean, it makes sense that you grew up around, even if your family wasn't going to church every week, your family was going to church on Easter and Christmas, and you were around the Church of England and Anglican services. And so I really do think that we can't get rid of our childhood. And I think that our childhood is going to inform sort of where our core base level intuitive emotional temperamental sensibilities are directed, and so that makes a lot of sense. And at the same time, I just want to highlight the way in which the actuality of neoliberal capital pulls us away from that, right? Because you're in Korea now and you're not surrounded by Anglo people, and you're not surrounded by the Church of England, I'm assuming, although I wouldn't be surprised if there are Anglican services available in Korea somewhere. I know that there are
Rather,
Christian.
rather a big cathedral, actually, rather a big one.
Interesting. So yeah, I know there are Christian services in Korea and stuff like that, but I mean, mostly I want to center in on where your political sensibilities seem to be quite aligned from a, let's say, an iconoclastic position through a sort of bodily God moment towards a very particularist identification with your ethnic background,
Yeah.
and your ethnic sensibilities, is what is the relationship, do you think, on the right to either movements that are more religiously based or more ethnically based? And how do they intersect? Because I know that's a big tension within right-wing politics, and I'd be interested to know how you're sense making that distinction, because I do know right-wing movements that are primarily secular, but they are ethnically based, and I do know right-wing movements that are primarily religious, which actually might not care so much about ethnically based, but
Yeah.
they more care about your religious identification and so forth.
It's a huge debate on the right, definitely. I suppose as the side more inclined to what you would, yeah, tradition, right? And so therefore you have lots of, I guess someone who goes to a Christian church regularly is probably what you would call legacy religion or something. I don't know what you'd call it, but there is that big tension. My opinion on this is very, very clear. Politics, the actual act of politics itself, is not some godly thing. And that is an issue. That is the misstep the right has made for so long. Now, I suppose my temperament's from a kind of informed philosophically, politically, saying, okay, this is rightist, this is particularist. Yes, that's true. Religion can be informed by politics, but I don't think it goes the other way around. And that's a misstep. I think actually on the right, what you see is actually that religious tension or having these religious principles actually makes that side much weaker. What the left is very good at doing is knowing when to have principles and when not to have principles. Whatever form rightism takes, it would be much better for it to be very agnostic towards towards religion, because basically you want to get, I guess I would say more particularist, but you want to get rightist things to happen in politics. You want to get rightist people in power. Whatever religion kind of gets that done, people have lots of different views. What could be? They could be some form of Christianity. It could be some sort of, people say Nietzschean paganism, but I think that doesn't really exist, I don't think. There's just, secular rightists pretty much. Whatever does that job in politics,
So you
that
don't
should
care
be the
whether
goal.
you don't care if there's right-wing Christianity and right-wing Islamism and the tension there that's at work between those, because you could have right-wing positions of both religious
Yeah,
orientations have
yeah,
exerting a major political power in England.
yeah. I understand exactly what you mean, and but I do take a very cynical view at this. I think ultimately those sorts of principles weaken that movement. And but one thing to say, and the Islam point is very apt for what's going on in the UK, very, very apt. Because there are, what's interesting is like the most conservative people in the UK are the Islamists and the Muslims, But conservatism in terms of rules around sexual mores and family structure and what things are allowed and disallowed in society, I suppose, those might work cross purposes at times. So in terms of, again, being very Machiavellian, which is my view on politics, unfortunately, very cynical view on politics, because that's just what it is. It's an earthly thing. It's not some spiritual thing. Is that if those work cross purposes at times, then they're your friends. They fall on the friend side of the friend enemy distinction. If there comes a time where, oh, you want to get rid of the things that make Britain, like, have the ethnos of the people who live there, whether it's Welsh, whether it's England, Scottish, that's another debate that I think is quite interesting, whether you think the UK is a propositional nation or not. Then that becomes, I would say, I guess, not anti-rightist in terms of social conservatism, but the form that I think it should take normatively, which is particularism. Things in a certain, there is a place for an ethnos, there is a cultural thing that ethnos should do, and there is a people that belong to that. That's where it would be against purposes.
So tell me more about this a particular ethos. Like for me, when I think about particular ethnos, where I would see that going politically is some sort of ethno state, you know, and people wanting to build ethno states and wanting to build communities that are more ethnically segregated. Does that where your mind goes? And do you see any do you see that as a viable political route today?
I think it is a viable one. I don't think it's one I agree with. I don't believe in necessarily the idea of an ethno state. I think that's a ridiculous one, frankly. I mean, like it's people and people take it in very strange positions. Like, okay, there's a Welsh ethnos and there's a Scottish ethnos and there's an English ethnos, but like doesn't mean like Welsh people aren't allowed to go into England. There are doesn't mean people aren't allowed to emigrate and these sorts of things. It's just it's it would be normatively correct for England to be full of mostly English people and to have English culture. That's a positive view. Just like saying, oh, okay, if we go to Saudi Arabia, it should be full of Saudis and have Saudi culture. It just makes sense, right? Like the reason why that makes sense, and I think that makes sense as a positive vision, is it is the antithesis to global liberalism, which I think is the thing which the impulses I'm talking about are spiritual, the political ones are actually fighting against. All the stuff about like woke leftists and college students is complete misnomer. There are forces that want to homogenize the planet for capital, and that would be the dystopia. Having say more controlled border policy so that when you're in England it feels a bit more English. That's not the dystopia, man. The grey sludge that's going to come out the other end of this thing if we let it keep going into overdrive. That's the dystopia.
So the main thing is the homogenization by so that's what I'm taking away so far from this conversation is that the main thing that you're concerned about is the homogenization of peoples and cultures by global capital, and you don't have, and so a left-leaning person might have a more universalist rejection of that in
Yeah.
regards to let's say a movement towards democratic socialism or even a movement towards communism in the full nature of the dialectical process, but you're going basically away from a universal notion and more towards a particularist focus on asserting ethnic boundaries which do not end in an ethnic state, but which reassert a type of cultural,
Normativity, I would say normativity and difference,
yeah,
which
that
I
is
think is a good thing to be
ethnically that.
asserting.
So does that go to the politics of breeding, like the politics of who we sleep with, the politics of who we breed with, the
Yeah.
politics of building families internal to one's ethnic group, and that is something that we should make culturally normative in regards to how we self-regulate ourselves with that, but not have it be state enforced? Is that what you're trying to think?
Yeah. You to bring it to the eugenical question is a really great question, and is actually the bit one of the biggest subjects in the book I'm working on now, the philosophical book I'm working on now. And my assertion in terms of that question, which I'm not really sure why, maybe it's a reaction to the mid-century Germans. Maybe it's a reaction to the fact that eugenical laws were in practice in the UK and Canada and the US until like the 1970s in terms of people who have mental disabilities and these sorts of things, which makes sense. But ultimately, my view on this, and I think it's true, is that everything you do is a practice in eugenics. Like I'm with
You have
Schopenhauer.
to unpack that. You have to
Yeah,
unpack that.
yeah. So I'm with Schopenhauer on this. Like humans are driven by the will, and that will is the will to life, and that will to life is not just the will to survive, but actually more importantly, because animals make sacrifices unto death to reproduce and protect their children. It is the will to reproduction. There is different forms of eugenics, right? There is the sterilization of peoples, which has happened like in the historical situations I've mentioned, which is a very extreme case. But there's also the very soft case, which is, where your parents choose to move to, where you choose to move to, what subjects you decide to do in school, whether you decide to try at school, whether you decide to get involved in crime when you're younger, or whether you decide to go and read some books. But these are all things that lead to the fitness function, which is your chances of reproducing, how much you are going to reproduce, and what conditions that's going to be under and what your offspring are going to be. Again, it's very cynical, but I do think that's the world we live in. And it's silly for liberalism to pretend it's not constantly doing eugenics in terms of playing with those things and trying to get, I would say, like widely homogenous, like sludge of a population that it can control easily. Like that's one of the scariest things about this, is that when you do departicularize people, you make them transient, you make them easy to move around like economic units, you make them all the same so then you can sell them all the same thing. Does that make sense? I call this idea eugenical realism.
So eugenical realism is basically a model of liberalism where we're not reflecting on the fact that we're losing our allegiance and unity to our particular ethnic groups, and we are becoming sort of a globally intermixed or globally interrace species.
It's not necessarily connected to liberalism or any of the politics stuff. I just think that's the implications of it. It extends to the fact that even, you know,
is it about becoming an intermixed? Is it about losing racial difference and becoming intermixed?
It will be in the future, but what I'm saying is it's a larger philosophical point attacking the, I guess, knee-jerk reactions to talk of eugenics that I don't think it's a bad thing. I think we need to talk about this because it is everywhere. Hopefully this will make it clear. The idea of eugenical realism even applies to the serf under medieval feudalism. Like the things he does, how well he serves his lord, all these sorts of things, they all contribute to his chances of reproductive survival, basically. And these have effects on successive generations. And we're pretending that there isn't different places on the spectrum of eugenics.
I feel in liberalism we have much more self-control over where and how we reproduce, basically. Whereas in sort of like the medieval serf, or like, for example, a slave in the United States would basically have their breeding chances and and structures over-determined by a sort of master-slave relationship. Whereas today we are allowed, whether I want to live in France or Canada, or you want to go to Korea, or I mean, all of that is under your control, whether or not you start reproducing when you're 20 or whether you start reproducing when you're 40. As a man, and as a woman, of course, you're limited by a biological clock, but all of that is under self-control now, it seems.
Perhaps.
Or whether or not you transition, or whether you you want to have whether you want to live an individual who's just has a studio apartment and you don't want to mess around or whatever, or whether you want to marry someone who's 10 years younger than you and have 5 kids on a farm.
Yeah, exactly. So I think hopefully that's sort of, we agree on that first point, that I think there's credence to this fact that I think that eugenics is actually more of a spectrum and it isn't like an off and on switch, you know? I think that's a fair point to make. The second point is more
trying to reclaim the word eugenics to like not mean just like sterilization campaigns that were led in the 20th century by like the Canadian government against Native American populations or whatever.
Yeah, and I think
I think it is a broad. I think it is. And is this correct? Is this coming out of a? I know there's a specific text, isn't there, that's becoming very popular about philosophy and breeding. You might know it. I'd imagine you'd know it.
Is this the one that they think Bap wrote, but it's the other guy?
I'm gonna see if is it Bronze Age Pervert?
That's right, Bap, Bronze Age Pervert. I can't remember the name of, because they think that this is the guy who wrote that. What's annoying
selective breeding and the birth of philosophy.
Yeah, what's annoying is, this is a complete tangent, I'm kind of annoyed that came out because it has a very similar title to what I wanted to call this one. So I might have to change the title now.
Okay. Your work now is actively engaged in reclaiming the term eugenics and trying to talk about it as a spectrum where we have to take a more self-directed control over the political ramifications of who we sleep with and how we reproduce.
That's perhaps an extension of what I would say philosophically. Ultimately, this is going to be a philosophical, not a political text, and that's kind of the second layer to this. Is the point I want to make clear is that eugenics is on a spectrum, and everything you do is essentially is a practice in eugenics, if we're going to use that word, because of the fact, because of the scope of our like biological substrate, essentially. The second thing that we were saying is the question of whether liberalism gives you a greater autonomy over that. I think that is debatable. The way you framed it, it makes it sound like that. Now, the level of control of our lives, you would argue we have under modern capitalism, I think is debatable. I think that's a debatable thing. I'm not saying that a slave in the American South or most serfs would have more autonomy. I'm not arguing that, but I'm just saying that modern capitalism is itself a arguable thing depending on what demographic you are and these sorts of things. And I again, you use the word reclaiming, which makes it sound like more of a political project than I think I'm planning for it to be.
Okay.
But it's an interesting use of the word because I do think it's true that global liberalism, maybe just liberalism in general, uses the knee-jerk reaction to a word like eugenics for maybe historically correct reasons as a way to deracinate people. And I think what is interesting about that, maybe that reclamation and that admission that actually these things are more on a spectrum, is that okay, this might be a horrible subject, it might be a dark subject, and it really is a dark subject once you dig into it, because this is going to be an incredibly dark book. But because it's realism, this is the truth, and you're in this game whether you like it or not, we're going to have to talk about it. And I think there is probably good and soft ways to do it, and very bad ways to do it. But there's also the other one where you ignore it, you don't acknowledge eugenical realism, and you let capital just take you away into whatever sludge you end up with.
I do agree that capitalism can overdetermine us to a great extent. And I would say that is our main overdetermination today. Our main
Yeah.
overdetermination today, our major overdetermination today is not of course, the feudal lords. Although now I am more and more convinced by the argument of Yanis Varoufakis of techno-feudalism, where he's
Mm.
actually saying that we do have types of techno-feudal lords in for example, the people who
Completely.
own the mass platform digital economies. But and so anyway, I'd be interested to see how you work with these dimensions in your book. But I guess as a final or a closing down question, it would be more to the personal, concrete actuality of where you are today, being in Korea, writing a book on eugenics, writing a book and then stating explicitly that you're mostly concerned not with religious identification, but with ethnic identification. Do you plan to move back to England in the long term? And do you, or are you planning to settle down in Korea? Or how are you planning to live out your eugenic realist philosophy?
Yeah. I always am very careful. Maybe I haven't been in this conversation, but I'm trying to be careful to use the word ethnos because I'm not
What is ethnos? Is it different than ethnicity?
yeah, it includes ethnicity. Ethnicity is important, but you know, these ethno state idiots, they say like, oh, you have to be this percentage thing to be an Anglo or whatever, and it's silly. Like it's a complicated mix of who you are actually ethnically, fine, and who you are culturally, and then who you are spiritually. I would say it's a mixture of those things. And I think that's a much more intelligent way to look at the problem than, again, it's one of those things where, yeah, ethnicity is one of those words like eugenics that is used by the liberal order to control certain impulses that I think is a bad thing, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be scared by. But yes, your question about future of my life, very good question. Ultimately, England will always be my home, and whether I like it or not, I'm a cultural Christian. So there you go.
All right. Well, Samuel, this has been a really nice window into both your life and your philosophy. I really feel like I've got, I like this model because I feel like I've got a better sense of where you're coming from politically and philosophically as a result of that. And of course, it couldn't be any other way that I don't think we can really understand each other unless we have a full scope of the temporal history of each other to situate our ideas in that way. Otherwise, it's just too flat. It's too one dimensional and too easy to fall into opposition where there's a richer space there
Yeah,
of difference and perspective and I also sort of can see the need for focusing on the particular.
yeah,
I can see the need for focusing on a specific form of difference that has been obfuscated by not only neoliberal capitalism, but also sort of forces that seek to push everything into what I think you're calling a homogenized sludge. So yeah, it's definitely interesting and appreciate the work that you brought to Philosophy Portal in the past, both the conversation on the iconoclast as well as your contribution to Abyssal Arrows. And I hope that there will be future possibilities to engage with your work as it evolves. Certainly, I'll be interested to speak with you whenever your next book on the topic of eugenic realism comes up. It's definitely been something. While I haven't written on eugenics, I am interested in the question of reproduction, and I am interested in the question of the intersection between how the human being reproduces itself in what I would call techno-capitalism. So these conversations are ones that I'll keep sort of motivated for in the future. And I guess as a final thought, what would be something that you would want the viewer or the listener to take away from this conversation, and maybe points of engagement with your work?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say what you're doing is really interesting. I think it's a great move away from the parasocial, because even people who engage in intellectual discussions online with each other, they have to, by necessity of the parasocial nature of things, or the fact that you have very intermittent bursts with someone, you have to place them in boxes. You have to say, oh, he's a Marxist leftist, he's a right winger, or he's a materialist, he's a Christian conservative, all this sort of stuff. And I think that's good for the beginning, but I think for humanity to get anywhere that's beyond doom scrolling and what I have in this conversation decided to call the homogenous sludge, this is the way to do it. So I think what you're doing is really great, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on it. I would like people to go, especially if they've enjoyed the messiness of this conversation, especially from my end, go and check out my channel and go check out some of the conversations I have on there, because it's definitely over time got a more frank, and I think, as a result, a bit more interesting, and I think a bit more honest.
Fantastic. All right, Samuel, and for all the viewers watching us, have a great evening.